The icy flood water closed over Jake's head as he and Tom Morrison were swept into the raging current. The massive cottonwood log had struck them with devastating force, sending Thunder stumbling and throwing both men from the saddle into the churning brown torrent. Jake fought his way to the surface, gasping for air and immediately looking around for Tom. The older man surfaced a few yards away, sputtering and clearly struggling against the powerful current. Neither of them were strong swimmers, and their heavy boots and clothes were dragging them down. "Grab onto something," Jake shouted, spotting a smaller log floating nearby. Tom managed to get his arms around the log just as another wave of debris swept past them. Jake kicked hard, trying to angle himself toward the shore, but the current was relentless. Every stroke toward safety seemed to carry them 2 strokes downstream. On the hillside, Sarah Morrison watched in horror as the 2 men were swept away from the landing spot. Her son Jacob stood beside her, both of them helpless to do anything but watch and pray. "Papa!" Jacob cried out, though his voice was lost in the roar of the flood. But Thunder was far from finished. The black gelding had managed to keep his footing when the log struck, and his years of cattle work had taught him to think independently in crisis situations. Without any guidance from Jake, the horse plunged into the flood and began swimming powerfully downstream, following his master's scent trail in the water. Thunder was a mountain horse, bred for strength and endurance in harsh conditions. His powerful chest and hindquarters drove him through the current, while his intelligence guided him around the worst of the debris. He could see Jake's head bobbing in the water ahead, and nothing was going to stop him from reaching his rider. Jake was beginning to tire badly. The cold water was sapping his strength, and his waterlogged clothes felt like they weighed 100 pounds. He could see Tom Morrison struggling on his log about 20 feet away, but Jake was barely managing to keep his own head above water. That was when he heard the familiar sound of Thunder's nickering call. Jake turned his head and saw the black horse swimming toward him with determined strokes, his nostrils flaring as he fought the current. "Thunder!" Jake gasped, reaching out as the horse drew near. Jake grabbed Thunder's saddle horn and felt immediate relief as the horse's strength supported him. But Tom Morrison was still in trouble, clinging to his log but being swept toward a pile of debris that had jammed against a cluster of trees. "We have to help him," Jake shouted to Thunder, as if the horse could understand. Perhaps Thunder did understand, or perhaps he simply followed Jake's guidance. But the gelding began swimming toward Tom's position. The current was carrying them all downstream, but Thunder angled across the flow with powerful strokes. They reached Tom just as his log was about to smash into the debris pile. Jake grabbed the older man's arm and helped him get a grip on Thunder's other stirrup. "Hold tight," Jake called. "Thunder will get us out of this." The horse seemed to understand the increased weight he was now supporting. He adjusted his swimming style, using shorter, more powerful strokes to fight the current. Slowly but steadily, Thunder began angling toward the eastern shore, where the water was slightly calmer. It took nearly 10 minutes of hard swimming, but finally, Thunder's hooves touched the muddy bottom near the shore. The 3 of them staggered out of the flood water and collapsed on the bank, exhausted but alive. Jake lay on his back for a moment, catching his breath and marveling at his horse's intelligence and courage. Thunder stood over him, dripping wet but alert, nuzzling Jake's face as if to make sure his rider was all right. "Good boy," Jake whispered, reaching up to stroke the horse's muzzle. "You saved all our lives." Tom Morrison sat up slowly, water streaming from his clothes. "That horse of yours is something special, Mr. Thornton. I've never seen anything like that." Jake struggled to his feet, suddenly remembering the rest of the family. They were downstream from where he had left Sarah, Jacob, and baby Emma, separated by hundreds of yards of floodwater and rough terrain. "We need to get back to your family," Jake said. "Can you walk?" Tom tested his legs and nodded. "I think so. Nothing broken, just bruised and tired." They began making their way upstream along the flood's edge, with Thunder following behind. The going was difficult over the rocky, debris-strewn ground, and both men were still weak from their ordeal in the water. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they finally saw the hill where Jake had left the Morrison family. Sarah was standing at the crest, holding baby Emma and scanning the flood waters frantically for any sign of her husband. When she spotted the three figures walking along the shore, she let out a cry of joy that could be heard even over the sound of the rushing water. Tom, Tom, you're alive. We're all right, Tom called back, waving his arms. Thanks to Mr. Thornton and his horse. But there was still the problem of getting reunited. The flood water stretched between them like a brown sea, and none of them had the strength for another swimming attempt. Jake studied the situation, looking for any way to bridge the gap. That was when he noticed that the water level was beginning to drop. It was subtle at first, just a few inches, but it was definitely receding. The worst of the flood had passed, and the creek was slowly returning to its normal channel. We need to wait, Jake told Tom. The water's going down, but it'll take a few hours before it's safe to cross. They found a sheltered spot among some rocks and settled in to wait. Jake built a small fire to help dry their clothes, while Tom kept watch for any signs of his family in distress. Thunder grazed on the sparse grass, seemingly unbothered by his heroic swim. As the afternoon wore on, the floodwaters continued to recede. What had been a raging torrent gradually became a series of connected pools, then a muddy stream running well above its normal banks. By evening, enough dry ground had emerged for them to make their way back to the hill. The reunion of the Morrison family was emotional and heartfelt. Sarah threw her arms around her husband and sobbed with relief, while Jacob peppered his father with questions about their adventure in the flood. Baby Emma gurgled happily, blissfully unaware of how close they had all come to disaster. Mr. Thornton, Sarah said, wiping tears from her eyes, we owe you everything. If you hadn't come along when you did. Jake shifted uncomfortably, not accustomed to such emotional displays. Just glad I was in the right place at the right time, ma'am. It was more than that, Tom said firmly. You risked your life for complete strangers. That horse of yours, too. We'll never forget what you did for us today. As night fell, they made camp on the hill, sharing what little food Jake had in his saddlebags. The Morrison family had lost everything in the flood, their wagon, their oxen, all their supplies, and trade goods. They were stranded miles from anywhere, with only the clothes on their backs. What will you do now? Jake asked as they sat around the small campfire. Tom stared into the flames, his face reflecting the weight of their situation. I don't rightly know. We were heading to Fort Collins to trade, but without our goods. He shrugged helplessly. The Double Bar Ranch always needs good workers, Jake said quietly. My boss, Mr. Patterson, he's a fair man, pays decent wages, and provides housing for families. You'd put in a word for us? Tom asked, hope creeping into his voice. More than that. I'll ride over there tomorrow and talk to him personally. A man who keeps his head in a crisis like you did today, that's the kind of fellow we need. Sarah squeezed her husband's hand. It would be a new start for us, she said softly. What about little Emma? Tom asked. A ranch is no place for a baby. Jake smiled, remembering how the infant had trusted him completely during their dangerous crossing. Mrs. Patterson loves children. She's been wanting Mr. Patterson to hire more family men so she'd have some young ones around the place. Emma would be spoiled rotten inside a week. The next morning dawned clear and calm, as if nature was apologizing for the previous day's violence. The creek had returned to its normal size, though its banks were littered with debris and muddy deposits showed how high the water had risen. Jake scouted around and found the Morrisons' wagon, or what was left of it. The wooden bed had been smashed against a tree, and their belongings were scattered across miles of countryside. He did manage to recover a few items, Sarah's sewing basket, somehow intact in a sheltered eddy, and Jacob's collection of interesting rocks that had been heavy enough to sink and stay put. It's not much, Jake said, presenting their recovered possessions, but it's something. Sarah clutched her sewing basket to her chest, as if it contained great treasure. This basket belonged to my grandmother, she whispered. I thought it was lost forever. They buried what remained of the wagon and held a brief memorial for the two oxen, who had served the family faithfully for 3 years. Then, Jake helped them climb aboard Thunder for the ride to the Double Bar Ranch. The horse carried them all without complaint, though it was crowded with 4 people and a baby on his back. Tom walked alongside much of the way to spare Thunder the extra weight, but the sturdy gelding never showed any sign of fatigue. Mr. Patterson listened to Jake's account of the flood and the Morrison family's situation with growing interest. He was particularly impressed when Jake described Tom's cool head during the crisis and his willingness to risk his own safety for others. "We can always use good people," Patterson decided. "Tom, I'll start you as a general ranch hand, but if you prove yourself, there's opportunity for advancement. Sarah, my wife, could use help with the cooking and household management. We'll provide a cabin for your family and fair wages for both of you." The Morrison family exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe their good fortune. What had started as a disaster was turning into the opportunity of a lifetime. "There's just one condition," Patterson added with a slight smile. "That baby of yours has to visit the main house every day. Mrs. Patterson hasn't stopped talking about her since Jake told us about the rescue." 6 months later, the Morrison family was thriving at the Double Bar Ranch. Tom had proven himself an excellent worker and had been promoted to assistant foreman. Sarah's cooking had become legendary among the ranch hands, and she was teaching Mrs. Patterson her secret recipe for apple preserves. Jacob had adapted to ranch life with the enthusiasm of youth, learning to ride and rope under Jake's patient instruction. And little Emma, now walking and babbling constantly, had indeed become the spoiled darling of everyone on the ranch. Jake often reflected on that day by Willow Creek as he went about his daily rounds. The flood had been a tragedy that could easily have claimed 5 lives, but it had also brought together people who might never have met otherwise. Sometimes, he thought, the worst disasters led to the greatest blessings. Thunder, now officially recognized as a hero among the ranch horses, had earned himself permanent retirement from the harder jobs. He spent his days in the best pasture, admired by visitors, and treated like royalty by everyone who heard the story of his incredible rescue. The creek itself had returned to its peaceful nature, giving no hint of the violent torrent it had briefly become. But the cottonwood trees along its banks grew a little taller each year, their roots strengthened by the rich soil the flood had deposited. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, travelers stopping there to rest could hear the wind in those trees telling the story of a lone cowboy, his faithful horse, and the day they proved that courage and quick thinking could triumph over nature's most devastating power. The Morrison family never forgot that terrible and wonderful day. Emma's first word, according to family legend, was not "mama" or "papa," but "horse," much to everyone's delight. And every year on the anniversary of the flood, they would ride out to Willow Creek with Jake and Thunder, sharing a quiet moment of gratitude for the random chance and brave hearts that had saved them all. Tom Morrison often told his children and grandchildren in later years that a man's true character was revealed not in times of comfort and plenty, but in moments of crisis when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The story of Jake Thornton and Thunder became a family legend, passed down through generations as an example of selfless courage and the unbreakable bond between a cowboy and his horse. And on the Double Bar Ranch, Jake continued his quiet life, never seeking recognition for his heroic actions, but always ready to help anyone in need. He had learned that day by Willow Creek that sometimes being in the right place at the right time wasn't just luck. It was a responsibility to act with courage and compassion, no matter the cost to yourself. The flood waters had long since receded, but the bonds forged in that crisis lasted a lifetime, proving that even in the harsh and unforgiving frontier, human kindness could create families from strangers and turn disaster into blessing. Jake Thornton leaned low over Thunder's neck, urging every last bit of speed from the powerful gelding. The horse's hooves pounded against the prairie ground in a rhythm that matched Jake's racing heart. 50 yards ahead, he could see the woman who had fallen, struggling to get to her feet near the water's edge. The wall of floodwater was maybe 30 seconds away from reaching her position. Jake had seen flash floods before, and he knew that once that brown torrent hit, nothing in its path would survive. Trees that had stood for decades would be ripped from their roots. Boulders the size of wagons would be tossed like pebbles. "Come on, Thunder!" Jake shouted over the roar of approaching water. "We can make it!" The black horse responded with a burst of speed that Jake had never felt before. Thunder seemed to understand the desperation of the moment, his powerful muscles bunching and extending as he devoured the distance to the creek. Jake's mind raced as fast as his horse. He could see the woman was hurt, favoring one leg as she tried to hobble toward the rocks where her family waited. There was no time for her to reach safety on foot. The only chance was for Jake to get her out of there, but that meant riding directly into the path of the flood. As Thunder's hooves hit the softer ground near the creek, Jake could feel the earth trembling from the approaching water. The sound was deafening now, like standing next to a waterfall. Debris was already floating in the creek where it had been peaceful just minutes before. Sarah Morrison looked up through her tears and, pained to see the cowboy bearing down on her. For a moment, she thought he was going to ride right past, but then she saw him lean sideways in his saddle, his right arm extended toward her. "Grab on," Jake yelled, though his words were almost lost in the noise. Sarah didn't hesitate. As Thunder thundered past, she reached up and felt Jake's strong grip close around her wrist. The momentum nearly dislocated her shoulder, but she held on as Jake hauled her up behind his saddle. The flood crested the bend in the creek just as Thunder's hooves found purchase on the far bank. Jake felt the spray from the leading edge of the water hit his back as they climbed toward higher ground. Behind them, the peaceful creek disappeared under a churning brown torrent 20 feet deep. But they weren't safe yet. Sarah was barely clinging to Jake's waist, her injured ankle making it difficult for her to maintain her grip. Worse, Jake realized with growing horror that the flood was much wider than he had anticipated. The water was already spilling out of the main channel, turning the entire valley floor into a temporary lake. "Hold tight," Jake called back to Sarah. "We need to get to those rocks." He guided Thunder toward the boulder pile where Tom Morrison was frantically waving his arms. The man on the rocks was pointing and shouting something that Jake couldn't hear over the water's roar. Then, Jake saw what had Tom so upset. The 12-year-old boy was still holding the baby, but he was having trouble maintaining his balance on the wet rocks. The child looked terrified, clutching the infant while trying not to slip into the rising water that was now lapping at the base of their refuge. Jake made a quick decision. He rode Thunder as close to the rocks as possible, then helped Sarah slide down from the horse. Her husband immediately scrambled down to help her climb to safety. "The baby," Sarah screamed as soon as she could catch her breath. "Jacob can't hold her much longer." Jake looked up at the boy, who was indeed struggling. The infant was crying and squirming, and Jacob's arms were clearly getting tired. One slip, and both children would fall into the flood. Without dismounting, Jake guided Thunder closer to the rocks and stood up in his stirrups. He was just tall enough to reach the ledge where Jacob crouched. "Hand her down to me, son," Jake said in his calmest voice. "Nice and easy." Jacob's eyes were wide with fear, but he carefully lowered the baby toward Jake's outstretched arms. For a heart-stopping moment, little Emma dangled between them. Then, Jake's hands closed securely around her tiny body. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, as if she somehow sensed she was safe. Jake cradled her against his chest with one arm, while controlling Thunder with the other. The horse stood rock-steady despite the chaos around them, as if he understood the precious cargo they carried. "Now you come down," Jake told Jacob. "Your folks are right here." The boy carefully worked his way down the rocks to where his parents waited. Tom Morrison's face was streaked with tears of relief as he pulled his son into a fierce embrace. But their ordeal was far from over. The flood had transformed the entire valley into a raging sea. Their wagon was already underwater, along with all their possessions and supplies. The oxen had vanished completely, probably swept downstream in the first moments of the flood. Jake looked around, assessing their situation. The boulder pile they occupied was perhaps 8 feet above the normal creek level, but the flood was still rising. What had been a small stream was now a river hundreds of yards wide, carrying tree trunks and debris that crashed against their rocky island with tremendous force. "Is everyone all right?" Jake asked, raising his voice to be heard. Sarah twisted her ankle. "But we're all alive thanks to you," Tom replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Jake Thornton," he said, shifting the baby to get a better grip. "Double Bar Ranch, about 10 miles south of here." "Tom Morrison," the man replied. "This is my wife Sarah, my son Jacob, and little Emma you're holding there." Jake nodded, then looked critically at their surroundings. This water's still rising. We need to get to higher ground. Where? Sarah asked, looking around at the vast expanse of floodwater. We're trapped. Jake studied the terrain carefully. About a quarter mile to the east, he could see a low hill that rose well above the flood level. The problem was getting there. The water between their rocky refuge and that hill was deep and flowing fast, filled with dangerous debris. Thunder's a strong swimmer, Jake said thoughtfully. But I can't carry all of you at once. Take the baby first, Tom said immediately. She's the most helpless. No, Sarah protested. I won't let Emma out of my sight again. Jake understood her fear, but he also knew they had to be practical. The water was still rising, and they might only have minutes before their rocky island disappeared completely. Mrs. Morrison, he said gently, your baby needs to get to safety, and I need both hands free to control my horse in this current. But I promise you, I'll come back for the rest of you. Sarah looked into Jake's steady gray eyes and saw something that reassured her. This was a man who kept his promises. All right, she whispered, then kissed Emma's forehead. Take care of my baby. Jake nodded solemnly. Thunder, and I will guard her with our lives. He urged his horse into the flood water, feeling the powerful current immediately try to push them downstream. Thunder fought against the flow, his hooves finding purchase on the rocky bottom as they began the dangerous crossing. The debris in the water was the biggest threat. A large tree trunk swept past them, missing Thunder's shoulder by inches. Jake had to constantly guide the horse around floating obstacles while keeping little Emma secure against his chest. Halfway across, Thunder stumbled as his hoof struck a submerged rock. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought they were going to go under, but the horse regained his footing and pressed on. Emma never made a sound, as if she trusted completely in this stranger's ability to protect her. When Thunder's hooves finally found solid ground on the far side, Jake felt a surge of relief. He guided the horse up the slope to the crest of the hill, where they would be safe from even the worst flood. Good boy, Jake murmured, patting Thunder's neck. Now we go back for the others. But as he turned to look back at the boulder pile, his heart sank. The water had risen another 2 feet, and the Morrison family was now standing on the very top of the rocks with waves lapping at their feet. They were running out of time. Jake quickly scanned the area and spotted a fallen cottonwood tree that had washed up against the hillside. He dismounted and carefully placed Emma in a sheltered spot between the tree's roots, where she would be completely protected from wind and rain. You stay right here, little one, he said softly. I'll be back with your family in just a few minutes. Emma gurgled and waved her tiny fists, seemingly content in her makeshift nursery. Jake remounted Thunder and plunged back into the flood, racing against time to save the rest of the Morrison family. The return trip was even more dangerous. The current was stronger now, and larger pieces of debris were sweeping downstream. Jake could see that Tom, Sarah, and Jacob were now standing in ankle-deep water on what remained of their rocky refuge. Who's next? Jake called as Thunder battled the current. Take Jacob, Tom shouted back. The boy didn't argue. He slipped into the water and grabbed onto Jake's stirrup, letting Thunder pull him through the flood. Jake got him safely to the hill, then immediately turned back for the third crossing. By the time he reached the rocks again, Sarah was standing in water up to her knees. Her face was pale with fear, but she was ready to trust this cowboy stranger with her life. The crossing with Sarah was the most difficult yet. Her injured ankle made it hard for her to help herself, and Jake had to support most of her weight while guiding Thunder through the treacherous current. At one point, a massive tree trunk swept toward them, and Jake had to spur Thunder into a desperate burst of speed to avoid being crushed. When they finally reached safety, Sarah collapsed on the hillside, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. But there was still one more trip to make. Tom Morrison was the last one on the rocks, and by now the water was up to his chest. The current was so strong that he had to grip the stone with both hands to avoid being swept away. Jake urged Thunder back into the flood one final time, knowing this would be the most dangerous crossing of all. The horse was getting tired, and the debris in the water was getting heavier and more frequent. But there was no choice. They couldn't leave Tom behind. As they approached the rocks, Jake could see that Tom was barely holding on. The man's strength was failing, and The current was trying to tear him loose from his precarious handhold. "Jump!" Jake yelled, riding Thunder as close as he dared. Tom let go of the rock and lunged toward the horse. Jake caught him under the arms and hauled him up behind the saddle, but the effort nearly unseated both of them. Thunder staggered under the sudden weight shift, then found his balance and began the final crossing. They were almost to safety when disaster struck. A huge cottonwood log, easily 40 feet long and 3 feet thick, came sweeping down the current like a battering ram. Jake saw it coming and tried to steer Thunder out of its path, but they were too close to shore to maneuver effectively. The log struck Thunder's hindquarters with tremendous force, sending horse and riders tumbling into the churning water. The morning sun painted the Wyoming territory in shades of gold and amber as the Morrison family wagon rolled steadily along the worn trail toward Fort Collins. Sarah Morrison clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma closer to her chest as another bump jolted the wooden wheels against the rocky ground. Her husband Tom guided their 2 oxen with practiced hands, his weathered face scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. "How much further, Tom?" Sarah asked, adjusting the blanket around little Emma's face to shield her from the dust kicked up by their passage. "Maybe 20 miles, Tom replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had made this journey 3 times before. "We'll reach Willow Creek by midday, water the animals, then push on to the fort before nightfall." Behind them, their 12-year-old son Jacob bounced in the wagon bed, his eyes bright with excitement at the adventure. This was his first trip to the fort, and every mile brought new wonders. Prairie dogs popped up from their holes like little sentinels, and hawks circled overhead in lazy spirals. The family had started their journey from their homestead near Cheyenne 3 days earlier, carrying supplies and goods to trade at the fort. Tom had loaded the wagon carefully with sacks of grain, preserved meat, and Sarah's famous apple preserves that always fetched good prices from the soldiers. As they crested a small hill, the landscape opened before them into a wide valley carved by Willow Creek. The stream meandered through cottonwood trees and tall grass, creating a green ribbon across the brown prairie. It looked peaceful and inviting after hours of dusty travel. "There's our water stop," Tom announced, pointing toward a grove of trees where the trail descended to meet the creek. "We'll rest here for an hour, let the animals drink their fill." What none of them noticed was the wall of dark clouds building beyond the northern mountains, still hidden by the rolling hills. The morning had dawned clear and calm, giving no hint of the violent weather brewing 50 miles away. 20 miles north, Jake Thornton rode his black gelding along the ridge line, checking fence posts and looking for strays from the Double Bar Ranch. At 28, Jake had spent most of his adult life in the saddle, earning a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in the territory. His keen eyes could spot a lame horse at 100 yards or track a missing steer across miles of broken ground. The wind had been picking up all morning, carrying scents that made his horse nervous. Jake trusted his mount's instincts more than most weather signs, and Thunder had been fighting the bit and prancing sideways for the last hour. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, patting the gelding's neck. "What's got you spooked?" He reined in at the top of a rocky outcrop and turned to look north. What he saw made his blood run cold. A massive wall of black clouds stretched across the horizon like a moving mountain range. Lightning flickered within the dark mass, and even at this distance, he could hear the rumble of thunder. Jake had seen storms like this before. They came down from the mountains with devastating force, turning peaceful streams into raging torrents within minutes. The rain fell so hard and fast that the earth couldn't absorb it, sending walls of water rushing down every canyon and creek bed. His mind immediately went to Willow Creek and the families who often stopped there to rest and water their animals. On a day like this, with good traveling weather, there would certainly be wagons down there. Without hesitation, Jake spurred Thunder into a gallop, racing south toward the valley. He had maybe an hour before the storm hit, possibly less. The question was whether he could reach anyone in time to warn them. The Morrison wagon reached the creek just as the sun approached its zenith. Tom guided the oxen down the gentle slope to the water's edge, where the animals immediately lowered their heads to drink. The creek ran clear and cool, perhaps 3 feet deep and 20 feet across at this point. "This is perfect," Sarah said, climbing down from the wagon seat with Emma in her arms. "We can refill our water barrels and let Emma crawl around on the grass for a bit." Jacob had already jumped from the wagon and was skipping stones across the water, delighting in the musical plops as they struck the surface. The cottonwood trees provided blessed shade, and a gentle breeze rustled their leaves with a sound like soft applause. Tom unhitched the oxen and led them upstream a few yards so they could drink without muddying the water where he planned to fill their barrels. The animals stood knee-deep in the current, occasionally lifting their heads to look around before returning to their drinking. Sarah spread a blanket on the grass and set Emma down to explore. The baby giggled and grabbed at the green blades, everything a source of wonder and delight. For a moment, the hardships of frontier life seemed distant and manageable. "Look at her go," Tom chuckled, watching his daughter's determined attempts to crawl toward a butterfly that had landed nearby. "She'll be walking before we know it." The first sign of trouble came from the animals. The oxen suddenly raised their heads, their ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring. They began to shift nervously, their hooves splashing in the water. "That's strange," Tom muttered, following their gaze upstream. "Wonder what's got them bothered." Then he heard it, a low rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder but constant and growing louder. It seemed to come from the direction of the mountains, carried on the wind that had begun to pick up strength. "Tom," Sarah called, pointing to the sky. "Look at those clouds." The northern horizon had turned an ominous black-green color, with towering thunderheads that seemed to scrape the sky itself. Lightning flickered constantly within the mass, and the rumble of thunder grew more distinct. "We need to get moving," Tom said, his voice tight with concern. "That's a bad one coming our way." But even as he spoke, he realized they might not have time to hitch up the oxen and load their supplies. The storm was moving faster than he had ever seen weather travel, and the rumbling sound was getting distinctly louder. Jacob looked up from his stone skipping, his young face suddenly serious. "Papa, what's that noise?" Before Tom could answer, they all heard it clearly. Not thunder, but the roar of rushing water echoing down the canyon upstream. Tom's face went white as he realized what was happening. "Flash flood," he shouted. "Everyone get to higher ground." Now, Sarah snatched Emma from the blanket and ran toward the wagon, but Tom grabbed her arm. "No time. The wagon's too close to the water. Get up on those rocks." He pointed to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the creek, the highest ground within reach. Sarah clutched Emma tighter and ran, her long skirts hampering her progress over the rough ground. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, staring upstream, where a brown wall of water had just come into view around a bend in the creek. The flood carried trees, rocks, and debris in its churning mass, moving with terrifying speed and power. "Jacob, run!" Tom bellowed, giving his son a push toward the rocks where Sarah was already climbing. Tom himself ran to the oxen, trying desperately to lead them to safety, but the panicked animals pulled against their ropes and stumbled in the rising water. Within seconds, it became clear that he had to choose between his own life and trying to save the livestock. The roar of the approaching flood filled the air like the sound of 100 freight trains. Tom abandoned the oxen and sprinted toward the rocks, his boots slipping on the wet stones as he climbed. Sarah had reached the top of the boulder pile and was looking back with terror in her eyes. Emma was crying, frightened by the noise and her mother's obvious fear. "The baby's blanket!" Sarah suddenly screamed. "I dropped Emma's blanket by the water." Tom looked back and saw the small yellow blanket that Sarah had knitted during the long winter months. It lay on the ground near where they had been resting, directly in the path of the oncoming flood. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah made a desperate decision. She thrust Emma into Jacob's arms and scrambled back down the rocks. "Sarah, no," Tom shouted, but his wife was already running toward the creek. The wall of water was less than 100 yards away now, a churning brown mass filled with tree trunks and boulders. Sarah reached the blanket and snatched it up, but as she turned to run back, her foot caught in a prairie dog hole. She fell hard, twisting her ankle, and looked up to see the flood bearing down on her with unstoppable force. Tom was climbing down from the rocks, but he would never reach her in time. From the top of the boulder pile, Jacob held his baby sister and watched in horror as the wall of water swept toward his mother. Emma's cries seemed impossibly small against the thunderous roar of the flood. That was when they saw the lone rider galloping toward them from the south, his black horse running flat out across the prairie. The cowboy was riding directly into the path of the flood, seemingly oblivious to the danger. But as he got closer, they could see the determination on his face. This was no accident. He was racing the water to reach them, and their survival might depend on whether his horse could cover those final yards before the creek became a raging torrent.